Well, no, I don't think the speech, the remarks made this morning will change how people view Boris Johnson's legacy. It's him putting his gloss on it. And I would say he did achieve things with some of the things he mentioned, the vaccine task force, the strong support for Ukraine. I would have said the furlough scheme in COVID, actually, that kept people in work. These were important things in his government. But you're quite right. A lot of things are midway or not done yet. So it's funny how it's amusing that that he's a booster, he's a rocket booster that is going to fall into the Pacific. But it's tragic, really, that he was a rocket booster on which the guidance system failed, and that has really been the problem. That he was this great soaring thing in politics, an extraordinary thing, which unnecessarily went wrong. And that is a tragedy for country and Conservative Party and for him. And I don't think, however he phrases it, can cover up that fact.
No, and Kez, someone probably would say, oh, he should have apologised, but there was no chance of any contrition here, Kez, was there? Why would there be? You've got to put if there's one lesson from politics, I presume it's always put your best foot forward, irrespective of the facts that surround you. And he was always going to try and phrase his own version of reality when it comes to his legacy.
Yes, that's never going to be his style, even if it was something that he felt deeply, any sense of regret. He'll be remembered for three things, really: Brexit, Ukraine, and the pandemic. Two of those things happened to him. The third almost took him by surprise, even though it was something he campaigned for. But behind those big momentous events that may well be the biggest events of the 21st century, there was also a darker side to, I think, his premiership, which is a real crisis of trust, integrity, and truth in politics more generally, which, if we don't attempt to now fix, could have long-lasting damage for all the prime ministers that follow in his footsteps.
Interesting point. And William, he deliberately referenced Cincinnatus, and we've had Mary Beard on to explain that for everyone. He knows what he's doing when he does these things. He wants to get people talking. Cincinnatus famously came back from his farm when the country needed him. Is there any chance, in your long experience of politics, are there any second acts when it comes to being prime minister?
Well, it's very rare, a second act as prime minister, very rare in history. There are some cases. There's Harold Wilson in our own lifetimes, or some of our own lifetimes. There's William Pitt the younger, there's Winston Churchill. So it does happen, but I don't see it happening in this case. I think he will cause trouble for his successors, for his immediate successor, Liz Truss, even though at the moment he says he will back her up, but he will cause trouble after time. He will still be knocking around in politics, but I don't see him coming back because, this was a pretty spectacular ending where more than 50 ministers and ministerial aides resigned in order to force out a prime minister whose behavior in office they could no longer support or tolerate. It's very hard to come back from that. There will always be part of the Conservative Party that will never forgive him for that situation, and they won't let him back.
William Hague, Liz Truss is the Prime Minister. Rishi Sunak is not. That's a person who you were very strongly supporting. He got 42.6% of the vote. Liz Truss got 57.4% of the vote, much closer than people had predicted or perhaps expected. Can you sit back now and say, why do you think Tory party members went for Liz Truss and not Rishi Sunak?
Well, I think Liz Truss is not to be underestimated. I mentioned in my column in the Times this morning that she can be a very good person to deal with, which I have found while she's been Foreign Secretary. And she expressed very clear policy, in a way, policies that are easier to sell than to say, well, we have to be careful. She is saying, well, no, actually, we can reverse the increase in national insurance and the rise in corporation tax and help people with their energy bills. We can do all of these things in this kind of very optimistic spirit that the country can grow, the economy can grow at 2.5% a year for the next 10 years. So understandably, people want to see those things happen. Now, of course, the challenge is going to be, is it possible to do all of those things at the same time? But I think that's what I think Conservative members responded to that. Let's do all these things. Let's have the country that we want. Now, the question is, can we get there?
Well, we shall see. Kezia Dugdale, on the energy plan that we expect Liz Truss to unveil later this week, this idea of freezing everyone's energy bills, businesses perhaps, and households. the IFS have said that this is a terrible idea, but actually it probably is unavoidable. What do you think of it?
Yeah, I think Paul Johnson said it was almost the least worst option available on the table. And the question is whether you do it via the tax system, this will be in the entry of the Chancellor, and address it within existing spending, or whether it becomes something that's added and aligned to our energy bills for the next 15 or 20 years. That's the big question, but I think that's inevitably where we're going to go. I suspect we'll get a freeze for the next 6 months, VAT cuts on bills, and some sort of cut in business rates. I think if there's any lessons from Boris's term in office, you want a big number, you want a big day and a big number. So I suspect there'll be a package of the £100 billion mark, which will be able to talk to some serious help for people in the winter months ahead.
William, what do you think about the plan, if this is what it is? £100 billion pounds more, debt, borrowing, however you want to look at it. Everyone getting this help, including people who don't really need it. And then, what's next? I mean, or should we have perhaps looked at taxing again the huge profits of some energy companies in the form of an additional windfall tax?
Well, yes, I do think it's probably a mistake to rule out further windfall taxes, partly because the threat of such taxes gives the government a strong lever in negotiations with energy companies in agreeing or setting prices or setting up a new system of an electricity market in the future where the price of electricity wouldn't be linked to the gas price anymore. Giving up the option of more windfall taxes takes away an important threat that the government has got to the companies. So I am concerned about that. I think it's probably true that it's the worst policy except for all the other policies. For what you can just bring in quickly, simple, that brings down the rate of inflation that's going to happen over the next year. There are advantages to it, but I would say it can't be a policy where the taxpayer is financing windfall profits. And it can't be an indefinite policy where better off people are left with no incentive to save energy in the future. So it should be clear at the beginning that it's not forever.
But how do you get out of it? I mean, that's all completely true. But what happens when the war in Ukraine goes on and energy prices are still high in a year's time? No government's going to turn off the £100 billion tap, are they?
Well, that's why I would say at the beginning that this is not forever for everybody. So don't think you can just use all the energy that you ever used to use. We should particularly better off people have an incentive to save energy. And also they have to reform the way the market works in the meantime. I think they will probably do this. So bailing everybody out for the moment, as it were, but changing the way the energy market works so that, as I just mentioned, the price of electricity wouldn't be determined by the price of gas.
Yeah.
And that would take some time to work out how to do that without having lots of bizarre effects. But that needs doing over the coming months so that in future winters, we don't have exactly the same situation again.
Yeah. What do you make of Liz Truss's relationship north of the border? She's not inheriting a good relationship, which is one positive perhaps, but it's not necessarily a sign she's going to make it any better.
Well, yes, there's Scotland the place and then there's Scotland the political problem, and it won't be right at the top of her inbox, but it will be in there. And I've watched so many prime ministers now grapple between whether to ignore Scotland and just get on with it or whether to try and love bomb it. Both of those strategies, in my view, are an error. And what they really need to focus on is just making the union work, because if the union works, then support for the union within Scotland will rise in line with that. So there are examples of how you can prove the strength of the union in recent times. Furlough is a good example of that. There may even be an opportunity for Liz Truss to carve a very delicate narrative around the energy crisis. Yeah. So if she does borrow a tremendous amount of money in order to help people with their bills, she might be able to gently say, that's because of the strength of the union, I'm able to do that. Now, if she comes in with tackety boots and says, Scotland, I'm here to save you, it'll go down like a bag of sick. But there is a version of how you can make a slow-burning case for the union with careful language. I'm just not used to seeing Conservative politicians do that. So forgive me for being a little bit concerned that might not be what transpires in the coming weeks.
Meanwhile, can she? We spoke to the SNP earlier today and they said it's in the hands of Scotland whether there's a referendum or not. And I firmly think the constitutional position is that it's in the hands of Westminster. Is it possible, you talked about ignoring Scotland, is it possible to at least ignore the demands for a referendum for the next 2 years? That feels like it is within her gift just to say no.
Well, I mean, She can do that. It'll not get her very far because it will allow Nicola Sturgeon to keep repeating that claim. Boris didn't say no. When he was at his most disciplined, he would say not now. That's a smarter bit of language because it doesn't say there's no right ever for Scotland to ever revisit the question. It just says now is not the time. So actually, if Liz Truss goes from not now to no, she's hardening the position and probably making her political situation more difficult.
That's interesting. William, if you were around, what would you... do you think, with your mystic William hat on, that the government, a Tory government, would always be able to say no? Do you think that there will be another referendum in the next 5 to 10 years, for example?
Well, I think that it does depend on opinion in Scotland over the next couple of years. I think if the Nationalists keep winning elections, although their performance in government isn't great, so they ought not really to keep winning elections in Scotland, but if they use this issue to keep winning elections, well, then we will end up at some point having another referendum. But, the world will have moved on. It could have moved in either direction. If the UK's relations with Europe have become an even bigger mess, well, then Scottish nationalism would be strengthened. If the world has become a much more dangerous place where we need more defences and countries have to really stick together, well, then that might be much harder for Scottish nationalism. So there are these much bigger factors at work. I think it's quite possible there'll be another referendum, but there's no reason it should be in the next couple of years. There was one in 2014. The Conservative government, including Liz Truss, has a clear position at the last election of no referendum for them in the immediate future. So I don't think there should be one in the next few years.
Interesting.
Let's talk about foreign policy now. Challenges at home, of course, but Liz Truss's premiership will also be marked by trouble abroad as she'll have to maintain Western unity in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Boris Johnson had a very specific type of modus operandi when it came to dealing with Ukraine and indeed of forging this kind of alliance, this relationship with President Zelensky. Kezia Dugdale, what do you think, from what you know, what you've seen of Liz Truss so far, will her approach be to Ukraine?
I would suspect it'll be continuity Boris. I can't see any suggestion that she's going to be anything other than sharing his fervour and wanting to do whatever we can to help Ukraine in the situation that they're in. I think perhaps the more delicate and urgent relationship is the one that she establishes with President Joe Biden, not least because that will matter more in the coming months, in part to do with the Northern Ireland Protocol. So at the moment, he'll be quite reluctant to meet with her without any concessions on her approach to that. He's also facing midterm elections and is having a bit of a poll boost, and he's managed to do that around addressing his own energy crisis in the US. So there's something there for her to learn from. If she can establish that relationship with him well, then I think she'll generate some energy and momentum from that. But if it goes badly, it's only going to add to her political woes.
William Hague, you've written in the Times today, as you do every Tuesday in your column, you've written today about the meetings that you had with Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, both prime ministers and both foreign secretaries, of course, and how Liz Truss was, shall we say, perhaps a bit more responsive to your advice than Boris Johnson. Is that fair to say?
Oh, definitely. Well, you could at least tell whether she'd taken the advice or not, which was hard in his case. But my point in that column was that it's about not underestimating her. As you say, I supported Rishi Sunak, but she's a very organized person and decisive person. And if somebody gives her an idea, she picks it up and runs with it. So, this again is part of explaining why she has ended up being elected. I think on foreign affairs, absolutely, she will continue on Ukraine with what Boris Johnson has been doing. But that will have new challenges. This war looks like going on and on. And it's going steadily worse from Russia's point of view. But sustaining Ukraine through this winter, economically and militarily, will have new challenges. It will mean rallying Western countries again and again to support Ukraine. So that it's not just going to be a case of saying, all right, we'll carry on exactly the same. There'll be some big new challenges in supporting the Ukrainians.
And on the Northern Ireland issue, obviously as Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss was the one. It seems again like ancient history, who talked about introducing legislation to try to get around the protocol. Obviously, she's not going to be Foreign Secretary anymore. But what do you expect her approach to be on that?
Well, I think it will be a pretty hard line. That's consistent with what she's done before. And there are a lot of people MPs who voted for her from the very strong Brexit wing of the party who will be trying to hold her to that. Now, I hope she makes the most of being a hardliner to show some flexibility and to pave the way for some agreement on Northern Ireland with the European Union. But this is one of the most urgent things in her intro, that the deadline for responding to the EU's legal action against the UK on this expires next week. And so I think if she goes to Kiev, she should be calling at Berlin and Paris on the way back and trying to create a business-like atmosphere of showing them this is somebody they could deal with, that's somebody they could settle with. I think that's what she has to do over the next, well, along with everything else, over the next 10 days.
Just one final question about, to go back really to what we were talking about at the beginning about Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss and the contest that emerged. What do you think will happen with Rishi Sunak now? I think he said that he's going to stay on as an MP, but is he someone that could have a comeback? I mean, he's incredibly young.
Well, I think he's a very substantial figure for the future. I think he will be happy if he's not included in any way in the government. He'll be very happy as the MP for Richmond, Yorkshire. That is, as I can testify, one of the best things to be in the world. And you don't need anything else if you're MP for Richmond, Yorkshire. That is, he'd be.
You
very
don't need
happy.
their votes now, William.
Well, I just can't get out of the habit. And I mean it anyway. He's a substantial figure for the future. He got 43% of the vote. Hard-fought contest to be the leader of the Conservative Party and the Prime Minister of this country. And he is not to be written off for the future. He is a brilliant man. And I hope we will see more of him again in the future in frontline politics.
Kezia, is there another universe in which he goes off to California and thinks, thank God I'm out of the absolute pit that is Westminster politics. I'm going to go and live a lovely woo-woo SoCal life and be all the better for it?
Actually, no, my gut is he won't do that because he's shown by what he has endured that he wants to serve. So time is on his side. So I think he can happily sit back, ponder some of life's great big questions and then return at some future moment, which I'm not convinced it's going to be too far away.
Well, that's the other question. Yeah. How far away is the future is always a good question in politics, isn't it? Fascinating.